Me, come out here. It's a wonderful story, isn't it? It's a really thrilling story, and it's full of God bless, God bless, God bless. You can see the hand of God over it all. If you want to read it for yourself, it is in the Old Testament part of the Bible. It takes about 15-20 minutes to read, that's all. But that did it quite succinctly, didn't it, for us? You know the 3 R's? What are the 3 R's? Reading, writing and arithmetic. Well, I've got 6 R's today, but don't worry, they're not long. Okay, so Elimelech and Naomi left the land of Israel and they went to Moab, about 60-mile journey, and they took their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they became refugees, first R, in the land of Moab. And it worked out well for them to begin with, but then Elimelech died, and Mahlon and Chilion married 2 Moabite women. They married out of their culture, as it were. And then sadly, 10 years later, they died. So it's the story of Naomi to start off with. She became wretched. Not quite an R. She was sad, she was bitter. And it says so if you read the story. She became bitter because she'd lost everybody and everything. But then they heard news that back home in the land of Judah, the crops had started again. The reason why they'd gone to be economic refugees was because there was no food, but then they heard that the crops were going again. So Naomi's thought was, let's go back, I'll go back, perhaps there'll be a future and a hope for me. And she told the girls to stay where they were after their husbands had died in their own country, and maybe they would find husbands for themselves. But as you saw on the video, they started off with her and she entreated them, she pleaded with them, go back home. But one did and the other one didn't. And this is where the story of Ruth begins. She continued on with her mother-in-law. It's a lovely story of a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law's relationship. So often there's friction, isn't there, in that relationship, but they had become genuinely fond of their mother-in-law. So Ruth and Naomi continued on to back home for Naomi. Just a quick for myself as I think about being a refugee. I'm not a refugee, but we have refugees in this country, and for whatever reason they are, they need kindness, just as Naomi was shown kindness in her land. And it's not for us to judge why they shouldn't be here. But in God's provision, they received kindness in the land in which they were living. Went back home, and I think it showed in Naomi's face, because the women looked, the relatives looked, and is this really Naomi? I suspect that the sorrows and the sadnesses were showing on her face as she returned. But God was overseeing everything that was happening here. We saw on the video how they had to find some sustenance, they had to find some living. And so she'd said to Ruth, under the Old Testament law, you are permitted to go and pick up the pickings, the bits that are dropped, the bits that are left on the edges of the field, and glean that barley so that you can have grain, we can have grain and food to eat. And if you read the Bible, it says, as it turned out, or it so happened. You could say by chance or coincidence or whatever, she ended up in the field of a relative of her father-in-law. And she worked solidly and diligently, a foreigner in a different land. And she worked hard because she loved Naomi, because she was committed to her. And that promise that she'd made on the way back, on the path back to to Judah, my family will be your family. Where you go, I will go. And my God, your God, will be my God. Her commitment, her turning to the God of Israel and putting her trust as we sang in our first hymn, In Him. That stood true. So she worked hard round the field, picked up the gleanings, and the boss, Boaz, he noticed. He'd come to see his men, greeted them. Who's that strange woman? I don't recognise her. And the reapers, another R, explained to him who she was. And he came to her and he blessed her. And he said, bless you, my daughter, because you've come back. You are committed to us and you are helping out. So the extra provision was made by dropping extra stalks. He told his men to drop extra stalks so that she had plenty. He told her to come and get a drink when she needed to, and at the end of the day to come and have some food. And then he made sure she went home, as we saw, a huge, huge bundle of barley that she had reaped there. And Ruth tells Naomi what's happened. And Naomi is just bowled over by the fact that she'd been in the field of the relative. And she's getting the sense here that God is at work behind the scenes. And you know, for me, this is one of the most wonderful take-home lessons, if you want one, that in my life and your life, if you trust him, he is behind the scenes working things out, working all things together for good. It seems hard sometimes to believe that for those who love him. When you're in the midst of it, it's hard. But this is a grand story of showing how God cares for an individual, because he's got a bigger plan in my life than I know about, and a bigger plan in this story. And obviously we'll come to that if you don't know it already. And Ruth has come to find another R, refuge in the God of Israel. She's come to trust in him, and Boaz gives her that blessing. And Naomi says, God has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. And she's beginning now to turn from her wretchedness and finding hope and refuge back in God again. Naomi's concerned, as we all are, about the family line. It mattered very much that they got the land for the crops, and then they got an income and a means of being self-sufficient there. But who was going to do it? Naomi had got no husband. She got no sons. The family line needed to continue to keep the property, as we saw on the video, within the family. It mattered very much. So she hatches up a plan. Is it a God-given plan? I think it rather was. But it was really acceptable and expected that a brother should marry his brother's widow to continue their family. But there was no brother. So you went to the next in the family, the next kinsman, as it were. So no heirs, no brothers, but Boaz is a relation. So here's a relative. She tells Ruth to go and lie, I love that little bit in the story, go and lie at his feet after he's finished for the day. Tells her to get washed and dressed, put her best clothes on, put perfume on and everything else, and go and lie at his feet. And you can imagine her tiptoeing, can't you, not to wake him up, and just gently uncovering his feet while he's asleep. Why do you think he did that? She did that, sorry. Why do you think she uncovered his feet?
To show respect.
Pardon?
To show respect.
It was to show respect,
Yeah.
but I think there was more to it than that.
So do I.
You get cold feet in the night, what do? You wake up, don't you?
Yeah.
So that was probably what happened. It says something woke him up. It may have been his cold feet, I don't know. And he doesn't sit up and start swearing or anything. Bless you, my daughter. This is the greatest kindness. And she says to him, well, basically, will you marry me? It's not February the 29th, but that's basically what she's saying. But she can do that under the Old Testament law. That was perfectly permissible, as I said. So she goes to this relative, Boaz, and challenges him to fulfill the duties of a kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman is a relative redeemer, to buy back the land that belonged to her father-in-law, and with that came the responsibility to marry her and hopefully produce an heir to carry on the family line there. But there's just this little snag here. God is still overseeing the whole story, it's true story. And Boaz says, well, actually, there's just somebody slightly closer in relationship to Elimelech than I am. But I'll deal with him in the morning. So Ruth goes home, tells Naomi what's happened, and Naomi says he won't settle. She knows he won't settle until the business is sorted out, because he's got to sort out this relationship problem. So as we saw, he went and sat at the city gate, and the relative came up and said, hey matey, Ruth and Naomi have come back. Who's going to take responsibility for Elimelech's lands? And the guy said, well, I'll buy them. Yes, I'll have them. But, says Boaz, he also takes on the widow of the family here, Ruth, who's the one could probably just produce a child still. And the guy says, oh no, can't do that. We don't know if he's got other commitments. We're not told. So that leaves the ground clear, the way clear for Boaz to redeem, to buy back the land for the family. And so it's a happy ever after story sort of thing. We read in the last chapter that Boaz marries Ruth, and the Lord enables her to conceive, which makes me think probably she's a little bit older. He's probably an oldish man anyway, and she's able to give birth to a son. And this is one of the thrilling parts of the story, I think, because here's the last R. That is the start, where it's a continuation of the royal line. We're told that Ruth became the mother of Obed, who Naomi looked after, her mother-in-law looked after. And then he became the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David, who became the king. Now, if you think family trees are boring, that's why we've got family trees, they're not actually, and especially not in the Bible. If you were to turn to Matthew chapter 1, ever such a boring chapter, it's a whole list of names. But in there, it's usually the men that are mentioned, the father of, the father of, the father of, beget. But in that chapter, there are 5 notable women mentioned. And the 5 notable women are Tamar, and that's an interesting story in itself, how she became a mother. Rahab, who was the mother of Boaz, and we know the story of Rahab, possibly a prostitute. We've got Ruth here, a foreigner from another land. We've got Bathsheba. You may know the story of David and Bathsheba. And then the last woman mentioned is Mary, the mother of Jesus. They didn't normally put the women in the family line, but God is showing that he works through all sorts of people, all conditions of people, all backgrounds of people, for his purposes to work out, and he can use them. And I think that's just so amazing. So that was working back from Matthew. At the end of Ruth, we have the working forward. It's probably added later about Obed becoming the father of David, eventually, father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So family trees can be interesting. But let's just finish with the note on the Redeemer. Of course, that's pointing forward to Jesus, our Redeemer. Jesus bought for us salvation and freedom. He paid, the price was his own blood on the cross for us. And in this lineage, we see something. It's a pointer almost to the ultimate Redeemer, the Lord Jesus Christ, who has ability and authority to save us. He was sinless, but he became the Redeemer in love so that we could have life in the future. Did you ever watch, I don't know where it was last on, This Is Your Life? It was a programme, wasn't it, where they had all sorts of notable celebrities and they traced their history back. And there were a few skeletons in the cupboard, weren't there? You could say that in the family line of the Lord Jesus Christ, on the human side, there were more than a few skeletons in the cupboard with those women that are mentioned. But God used that for us. And that's just so, so wonderful. So that's the story of Ruth. It's a thrilling story. We can see God's hand in every bit of the story here. It's very different from the story of the one that you got, isn't it, of Esther? We see God's hand in that. But this is on up front, as it were. The Lord bless you. The Lord, they're conscious that God is working that. And if you want to take comfort this morning, trust God. Trust him for your salvation, for your future, but trust him in the everyday part of life, because sometimes when things get on top of us, we find it hard. We wonder what on earth is happening, don't we? But God knows, and that's where we hang in there. So I